IPC Spring 2018. Glad that you're here, and thanks for coming. So, we are looking forward to a great conference full packed of content. Before we start, please let me shortly introduce myself. My name is Sebastian. I work for SNS Media, the company organizing those two conferences which run here in parallel. And probably most of you are familiar with the fact that, of course, both parts of the conference are free to visit for everybody. So if you want to choose a Webinale session, go there. If you want to choose an IPC session, go there, whatever ticket you've booked. The only problem might be that most of the Webinale sessions are in German language, but we make sure that, of course, there are lots of content in English language at the IPC side, which represents more the technical side of this web conference. So this conference is about the web. And the interesting thing is about the web these days is that after so many years where we said, hooray to every innovation, everything which changed, everything what new, we said, that is cool and we want to embrace this, etc., etc. Now, I would say there's a kind of a skepticism a little bit more. So we look to from different angles today and we say, okay, the web is not bad by itself, but we need to have a closer look what's going on what are we doing with that medium and what impact this medium does have to humanity. For example, I just want to pick one little example. I think this was in February of this year. A group of former employees from Twitter, Facebook, Snapchat, etc. They formed a new center of humane technology, and what they're saying is this: those technologies and those services provided by Snapchat, Google, etc. They make us addictive. They want to make us addictive, and that's not always good. They're saying, okay, they want to warn us: take care of your kids, take care of your lifetime, and all these things. And that's kind of an interesting sign that things are changing. And among these folks is also the guy who developed the Facebook like button. Yeah, so that's kind of interesting. Secondly, there's of course Apple, and Apple just yesterday did their developer conference, WWDC, and one little detail I'd like to mention from their keynote from yesterday, they want to be the good part, the good ones. That's kind of interesting because, just to pick this little detail, the Safari browser, then the next version of the Safari browser is going to block trackings, for example, from Facebook, etc. So each time when you visit a website, and this website wants to send some tracking information to Facebook back, the browser is going to ask you, do you really want this? And that's kind of interesting sign that now Apple, being a software and hardware, or maybe a service and hardware provider, now says, okay, we want to care about these things. Yeah, we differentiate ourselves from the data-driven companies. That's kind of interesting. I don't want to say who is good or bad, but just it's kind of interesting because there are different opinions, different discussions, different directions which we can see these days. GDPR, also a funny topic. I guess it's kept most of you busy during the last months. Who was busy with implementing and working with GDPR? This was fun, right? Cool. Yeah, so GDPR, of course, the basic idea, I believe many of us, or most of us probably agree, the basic intention is kind of an interesting one and a good one. But on the other hand, we all agree more or less, okay, the implementation, well, it's not so digital friendly. It's a little bit clumsy, it's a little bit bureaucratic, and in the end, of course, it still raises the big question of, does that kind of regulation mainly help the big ones? Because for them, it's kind of trivial to implement that even in a worldwide way. And how about the small or the medium-sized digital offerings? Yeah, how high are the costs for them, and how high is the risk for them doing that? We're going to have a keynote tomorrow night discussing all these things. Of course, there's not a final solution for that, but I really believe this conference is a good place to discuss these aspects. And as I said, we are looking a little bit more skeptical to the web. It's also important to speak about the, let's say, the ethical dimension. And we also got for that some keynotes tonight. There's a keynote about accessibility in design. Tomorrow there's a keynote about how can we create or maintain trust in a highly connected world, in a highly data-driven world, in a highly artificial intelligence dominated world. What does all this mean, and what's the responsibility for every digital professional who is working on implementing that kind of, let's say, services and offerings and products. A new field, of course, is voice interactions. In general, we all know this is not brand new. Voice recognition systems are around there for many decades. But interestingly, maybe we've been so focused on the browser and all these things over 2 decades. Now it's kind of exploding, driven, we all know this, by Amazon's Alexa and other services. So we decided to implement a full day of voice assistant technology related talks, which is on Thursday. We look on the technology side, we look on the UX and design side, we look on the business and monetization side in many different aspects. So it's also going to be quite interesting to look on that. But of course, maybe you think this is just a hype, or we shouldn't overhype this. I think, or we believe, this is pretty worth have a deeper look on it. But on the other hand, of course, it's not about replacing other stuff through voice, but of course, it's adding a new vector, a new dimension to what we are doing in the digital field. So I'm really looking forward to this voice assistant day, which is going to happen on Thursday at this conference. 7.5 billion, that's a lot of money. That's really a lot of money, and probably you've heard that's the money Microsoft is going to spend for acquiring GitHub. And for those of you, maybe you're not a developer, GitHub is a huge platform for sharing code, for storing code, for versioning code, for merging code, for forking code, and all of those things. It's about software development in the open. And it's got about 30 million developers being there, and Microsoft now offers this huge sum of money just to acquire GitHub. And of course, some people believe, okay, this is still the old Microsoft trying to dominate everything in their way. But I'm pretty sure that if you've observed Microsoft over the last few years, this is not the old Microsoft anymore. They are pretty confident and they are pretty straightforward in supporting almost every relevant technology in a really credible way. The times where Microsoft was kind of polluting things a little bit here and there is definitely over. So I think it's a good news for the open source community. And in the end, especially if talking to you PHP developers here, you're doing open source, maybe not personally, but in general, the PHP community is doing open source than more than 20 years in a very successful way. And look what happened. Even those companies like Microsoft, who stood for being proprietary and saying open source is bad and all these things, yeah, now is investing so heavily in this platform for developing in an open source way. That's interesting news. Yeah? And in the end, the web has always been about openness. That's the main factor of the success of the web as we know it. And openness is winning. That's a good news. And of course, PHP is winning. That's also very, very interesting. And to be honest, yesterday night we had some conversations with some speakers from the PHP world, and I was asking them, do you have an explanation, or what happened that PHP is booming so much? And because I can tell you, this IPC Spring is the largest IP Spring ever. Yeah? But and I think, okay, that is great. We are very thankful for your loyalty, for coming maybe for the first time, or for coming again and again. And but the question is, there's nothing new happening in PHP in the sense of there's dramatic changes, something like that. And the good thing is about PHP is it is just working. It is there. Yeah? It is there, it is stable, and it seems to be really one of the major pillars of the ongoing digitization of the world's economy. That is extremely interesting and extremely exciting. Having said that, there's still a lot of to do in the digital product development, if from whatever angle you look on it, and it's all about finding enough skilled people. It's all about scaling up, scaling your technology on the one hand, and of course, scaling your teams and your organizations. And that leads me to our very first keynote, which I'm really looking forward to. Our keynote speaker, she used to be a writer. Then she switched careers and went to software engineering and is now a developer advocate. And I would just say, please give a warm hand to Emily Freeman.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Good morning. I am Emily Freeman. I am a developer advocate for a company called Kickbox. Our API is a better, smarter reCAPTCHA that ensures your users are actual people with legitimate email addresses. I'm thrilled to be here with you all in Berlin. Scaling systems is hard, but many of us are developers, so that's kind of our thing. Scaling people, well, that's significantly harder. People are complicated. Broadly speaking, companies have 3 stages of development. Infancy, those awkward teenage years, and if they survive the trials of adolescence, adulthood. An infant startup is so drastically different from its adult incarnation that they could be considered different companies. Each will have a unique mission and culture. Scaling isn't just about making what you have bigger. An ant can't be scaled to the size of an elephant because the internal structure is fundamentally different. Instead, companies have to evolve. But companies aren't living, breathing organisms. They're collections of people, families, tribes, civilizations. So how do you scale a team of 2 to 20? Well, the answer starts over 2,000 years ago in Sparta. This talk is going to focus on 3 distinct military organizations: the Spartans, the Mongols, and the Romans. Sparta's standing army was relatively small, whereas Rome's peaked at nearly 500,000. We'll look at the organization of each military, how they treated their soldiers, what they prioritized, and then we'll apply those lessons to our own development teams and organizations. Scaling an army of soldiers or developers or anyone else comes down to communication and collaboration. How do you keep a group of people informed and working together toward a shared goal? If there's just a few folks, it's probably no big deal, right? You're most likely all in the same room. You can yell at each other when you have a question or a comment. And you likely have the entire code base mapped in your head because you probably wrote the whole thing. But as your team gets bigger, more and more intersections of communication develop. And with that, opportunities for miscommunication. There's actually a formula for this. I shouldn't be surprised. Seems like there's a math formula for everything. I'll spare you the math, though. For a team of 5, there are 10 connections, which is not so bad. That's manageable. A team of 10 jumps to 45. A team of 20 brings us up to 190. And what about a team of 100 developers? Does anyone have a guess? 4,950. Nearly 5,000 ways your team can communicate. Now, is anyone else totally overwhelmed? Because I feel like this adorable yet definitely melancholy pug just thinking about that. Before I continue, I want to acknowledge that scaling is messy, and it always will be. We don't exist in a vacuum. There's no petri dish in which to try different approaches and see what works. Many times, due to resource constraints, we get one shot. And if we fail, well, game over. But there are some things that we can do better as developers and as managers. So where do we start? With Sparta, our startup of the ancient world. They were small. At its largest, the standing army numbered 10,000, and Sparta was obsessed with what it did best: war. They also had a thing with nudity, but this conference has a code of conduct, so that could get awkward pretty quickly. Most Greek city-states were fortified by a wall. Sparta, instead, chose to defend themselves with a wall of men. That's bold. This obsession with war started at day one. Newborns were taken by their fathers to the Geruza, a council of elders, for inspection. Infanticide was common in all of Greece, and Sparta was unfortunately no exception. Children who were not deemed strong enough were abandoned and left to die of exposure. At age 7, boys were taken to the Agosh, a military training facility and barracks. Girls were permitted to stay with their parents. They were actually educated and encouraged to exercise, which was unique in the Greek city-states. So yay for kind of equal rights. Spartans eschewed all comforts, and it's said that they were the only people for whom war was a reprieve from everyday life. Their staple diet consisted of blood broth, exactly what it sounds like, and the boys at the Agosh were regularly denied food and clothing. They were encouraged to steal, but beaten harshly if caught, not for stealing, but for being caught. Everything about the Agosh hardened these boys for warfare. At age 12, they were sent out with only a red cloak and expected to survive. At age 20, soldiers joined a syssitia, which is a sort of mess or club. Spartan peers and members of the mess had to vote to accept men into their group, and voting had to be unanimous. If a soldier had not been invited to join a syssitia by the age of 30, he would be denied Spartan citizenship and instead occupy a lower standing. Men were permitted to marry from age 20 on, but they would remain in the barracks away from their wives and children until age 30. They would continue to serve as reservists until age 60, which is crazy. All Spartans were equal and submissive to the unit as a whole. Soldiers who lost their hoplon or shield were disgraced because the shield protected not only that man, but the man on his left. Spartans were a small tribe of intensely loyal, overworked, and underfed soldiers who bravely took on the big boys of the ancient world. The Battle of Thermopylae pitted 300 Spartans, 700 Thespians, and 400 Thebans against, supposedly, 100,000 Persians. And isn't that how every startup would like to imagine themselves? Maybe without the core strength and rugged good looks. When you're in the startup phase, I want you to find what you do best. Spartans were unmatched in war. If an ally were threatened, all they had to do was send one man, a single soldier, dressed in that iconic red cloak, because enemies knew that a fight with one Spartan was a fight with all of Sparta. You're too young to be worried about anything but product market fit. Find the product that resonates with people and focus on that. You can A/B test button colors and all the other things later. Now is not the time. Hire generalists. You need people capable of solving just about any problem. Spartans didn't have special forces. Every soldier was trained in everything. They followed the same strategies, treated each other as equals. The people you need may not be up to date on the latest and greatest JavaScript framework, because really, who is? There's like 2 a year. But they do have a certain grit, a dogged determination to figure it out. At this stage, specialists could hinder progress by narrowing their focus too quickly. Keep your team agile and focused on how to solve the problem most efficiently, not how to solve it using a specific tool. Allow natural communication pathways to form. A desire path is a path formed through erosion, caused by humans or animals walking over the same piece of land over and over and over. Communication actually follows a similar pattern, and some of us are better at it than others. Observe who communicates with the team on your team, or communicates with your team most effectively. You need to delegate responsibility and bring others up to speed on things. Allow that person to take the idea and then deliver it to the group. Take on the big boys. Listen, when you've got 2 developers and 3 to 6 months of financial runway, you have nothing to lose. All the statistics say that you are going to crash and burn, so might as well make it spectacular. Give it everything you've got. 300 Spartans marched right up to 100,000 Persians and challenged them to a fight. Worst case, you learn some valuable lessons. Best case, you become GitHub and are purchased by Microsoft. The Mongols are by far my favorite of these 3 militaries. They are absolutely fascinating, and they serve as our analog for mid-sized teams. You can consider it our awkward teenager of an organization. The Mongol army topped out at about 100,000. It is, to this day, the largest geographic empire in history. They conquered nearly all of continental Asia, the Middle East, and parts of Eastern Europe. No one could have expected that Mongols would influence history in the way that they did. As a people, they sat quietly in the foothills of Siberia, mastering horsemanship and archery. But like most nomadic tribes who live in brutal conditions, they were tough, like real tough. The Mongols and their conquests are forever married to Genghis Khan, or Chinggis, depending on who you ask. Temujin, the boy who would become Genghis Khan, was born in 1162 to a lowly and unremarkable tribe. His father was poisoned when he was young, and he was left to the care of his older brothers, one of whom he murdered in a fight. So family reunions were probably pretty awkward. As a teenager, he married Borta, his first and most influential wife. Early on in their marriage, she was kidnapped, a pretty common practice in Mongolia at the time, and his rescue of her proved his military mettle. He went on to unite the Mongol tribes by instigating a brutal civil war, and was eventually named Great Khan, ruling over all of Mongolia. Genghis was a brilliant military leader. The Mongols conquered more land in 25 years than the Romans did in 400. He did this through a number of tactics. Mongols embraced religious tolerance. Conquered people could practice their religions freely. He promoted people on merit and brought people from lower tribes into his own, while doing away with the rich and powerful families. This made him extremely popular. Mongol society was pretty egalitarian. Both men and women contributed, and women didn't suffer from the typical patriarchal domination you see in many other societies of the time. minus the whole wife kidnapping thing. I haven't figured that part out yet. He reinvigorated the Silk Road and ensured safe passage for travelers. He enabled globalized trade. According to legend, a woman carrying a sack of gold could travel safely from one end of the empire to the other. The Mongols were uncommonly adaptable. Even though they had no experience with walled cities, they mastered siege warfare. Cities were often so afraid of slaughter that they simply surrendered as soon as the Mongols showed up. Mongols defeated nations that had 100 times the manpower, which is kind of what a mid-sized company needs to do. You've got that product market fit. Now it's time to build an empire. So how do we apply Genghis Khan's wisdom to our own teams? Avoid emotional decision-making. Above all else, Genghis Khan was a master strategist. In the early days, things are rocky. One day, you land a customer that will pay this month's entire AWS bill, and the next, the site's down and people are calling just to scream at you. Reactionary businesses rarely survive. So start to think in an OODA loop. And if you're unfamiliar, that's not just a fun English word to say, though it is fun, OODA. The OODA loop was created by Colonel John Boyd of the Air Force, the US Air Force. It stands for observe, orient, decide, and act. This will allow you to rapidly work through problems and prevent yourself from being bogged down by fear, uncertainty, and doubt. It's even better if you can get inside your competitor's OODA loop and upend their strategy. Avoid micromanagement. Mongol officers and troops were given significant freedom by their superiors in executing orders. As long as the larger objectives were met, Mongol soldiers could solve problems as they saw fit. In other words, they focused on what, not how. As you grow, you want to keep your team focused on the larger mission, whatever that is, but give them the room to do their job. Enable autonomy. Mongol soldiers typically maintained 3 to 4 horses at a time. They swapped horses frequently, and because of this, they could travel at high speeds for days without stopping or exhausting their animals. They had an extraordinary ability to live off the land, and in extreme conditions, they could actually live off their horses, mostly through mare's milk. Unlike other armies, they weren't dependent on supply logistics. Give your employees the resources they need to get the job done. Support them. And if you're in a management position, protect them. The VP of product wants a feature done yesterday, of course, because I always do. But now is not the time to freak out. Instead, embrace your inner Genghis Khan and start yelling at executives. That's terrible advice. Don't do that. You will get fired. Stay small. Much like our modern military, the Mongol army was organized into small squads that together made up larger units. Growing doesn't mean that all of your developers now report to a single manager who reports to a single VP who reports to the CTO, because I think we all know an organization like that. Instead, embrace those small groups, close-knit, family-like structures of people that can merge into larger groups when necessary. Start to introduce structure, but keep it simple. Now is not the time to go full in on Jira and hire a Scrum Master. Instead, do something as simple as implementing a daily stand-up. Start tracking features and bugs on a whiteboard or with a very simple tracking tool. At this stage, too much communication is inefficient, and too little will result in confusion. The last thing you want is 2 developers trying to fix the same bug. I have fixed those merge conflicts. 0 out of 10 would not recommend. Prevent yourself from falling into the trap of acting like a real company. whatever that means to you. I mean, file your taxes and do things legally, please. But now is not the time to start a formal annual review process or mandatory weekly one-on-ones. Instead, focus. It's easy at this stage to get excited about all the things. I see a lot of founders fall into this trap. And part of our job is to push back on crazy ideas as developers. Find your one market. Focus on your most successful value add. Once you have revenue and majority market share in one area, you can start invading the others. For now, stay focused. If you survive the pimply, mistake-ridden years of scaling a startup into an enterprise, congratulations, you're Rome. Rome is our large-scale organization. Reliability and predictability has become a lot more critical. You are an empire now. It's more important to protect what you've already built than it is to be a disruptor. Administration, management, and process eclipse rockstar developers and game-changing ideas. Rome was a nearly unstoppable force, one of the largest empires the world has ever seen. Its legacy continues to influence our daily life via language, law, government, religion, architecture, and more. The Roman Empire spanned over 2,000 years, and its military structure is a graduate-level course in and of itself. Edward Gibbon's The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire is just short of 4,000 pages. And that's just the decline and fall. I can't possibly do it justice in the next few minutes, but I will highlight the structure of the Imperial Roman Army, which reached its peak size of 450,000 in 211 AD. Emperor Augustus, the second emperor of Rome, founded the Imperial Army. Prior to him, Rome motivated soldiers with grants of land and increased wealth. But as land became more scarce, they shifted toward rewarding soldiers with a set amount of denarii after their service. For citizen soldiers, it was the equivalent of 13 years' salary, which sounds a lot like a pension. Am I right? The Imperial Army was split into two groups, what you can think of as officers and enlisted soldiers, very broadly. The commissioned officers were assigned to legions, heavy infantry made up of 5,000 Roman citizens each. Long-term professional soldiers served 25-year terms, and conscription, a draft, was decreed only in emergencies. In addition to legions, the auxilia was established. These enlisted troops were recruited from the peregrini, non-citizen residents. The auxilia supplied infantry, cavalry, archers, and special forces. Auxiliaries were awarded Roman citizenship after completing their 25-year commitment. The army also employed numeri, mercenaries, from allied people outside the empire. Today, we know these people as contractors. Organizationally, every province had legati, legion commanders, who reported to the provincial governor, and governors reported directly to the emperor in Rome, which is a much flatter structure than I would have imagined. While legionaries held a higher status, they depended heavily on the auxilia. Legions were entirely heavy infantry, foot soldiers, in metal armor. They were almost unbeatable by other infantry, but could not campaign alone. Just like developers would be lost without teams from product and DevOps and design. So what can we glean from Rome? Break into small teams. We do the same thing in our applications, right? When a class gets too big, we abstract logic away into smaller components. The same applies to people. But allow divisions to form naturally. Each unit in the Roman army had its own standard, which was a pole with a variety of decorations. The practical use was to visually notify soldiers where the bulk of their unit was on the battlefield. But these standards held deep meaning. Soldiers believed their standards represented a divine spirit, and they would pray to them. The symbol brought everyone together, much like a country's flag does for its citizens. Set a clear vision. Think of the small teams you formed as little Spartas. Go back to those fundamentals and allow each team autonomy. But be clear about the broader vision. Teams without a focused goal will naturally prioritize the things they're interested in, not necessarily the things that are best for the company as a whole. Leadership must regularly communicate the direction the larger organization is headed and why. And the why is even more important than the what, because it lends context and clarity. But be careful about how many times you moved the cheese, so to speak. It's okay to pivot if you need to, and the future of the company depends on it. But changing priorities every quarter will undermine your credibility as an organization. When your word means nothing, people stop listening. Become masters of logistics and planning. When you're big, logistics matter. And this is where teams like infrastructure and DevOps really start to play a critical role. Romans invested heavily in an extensive and well-maintained road system. They allowed their troops to move relatively rapidly as needed. While smaller armies could forage, purchase, or steal food, the Roman forces were simply too large. Instead, deployed forces were regularly resupplied through a massive network of supply chains. This infrastructure is what separated Rome from its competitors, just like the work you do allows companies to grow at breakneck speeds. For modern development teams, this is akin to project management. Agile, Scrum, extreme programming, it doesn't really matter. What's more important is that you pick one. Pick the one that works for your team and then implement it. Stick to it. The more logistical thinking you can remove from your developers' plates means that the more time they have to do what they do best. Engineer solutions. Invest in your employees. Take care of them. This means focusing on work-life balance. I know the Europeans do this a lot better than the Americans do. But if you're stressed because a release needs to go out today, I want you to ask yourself why. Is it because you set an unrealistic expectation with clients? Or is it because the calendar says that Thursdays are when we release new features? Emergencies happen. I think when the site goes down, everyone knows they're not going home for dinner. But those situations are few and far between. Working around the clock and checking email at home doesn't make your employees hard workers. It makes them former employees. Rome had a vested interest in the health and well-being of their soldiers. They developed sophisticated medical knowledge and practices, and for good reason. A sick soldier can't be relied on to campaign or defend a city. Offering generous insurance is a start, at least where we need insurance. But having conversations about mental health and burnout are also important. Anxiety and depression affect millions of us. Many of us in this room deal with some kind of mental health issue on a weekly, if not daily, basis. Engineering can be lonely, grueling work. You sit alone with a computer most of the day, punching in new commands and having it print out error messages at you, literally yelling at you for not coding well enough. Simply recognizing how hard your team works, acknowledging that everyone needs breaks, and promoting frequent, work-free vacations can do wonders for the longevity of your team. Introduce specialists. Or allow your generalists to become specialists. Some of your generalists may express an interest in management. Many will not. Allocating team members may feel relatively arbitrary at first, but if you allow some flexibility in movement between teams, each person will slowly find his or her niche. Finally, have honest conversations, no matter your size. Conflict is uncomfortable, I get it, but it is an absolute requirement for being a good manager, and I think for being a good human. I thrive in an environment of a late-stage startup. I don't have the risk tolerance for the early days of a startup when it's incredibly touch and go. And I'm enough of an entrepreneur that I don't do well constrained by strict rules that guide many large organizations. People that thrive when there are 2 developers may not transition well as the company advances and grows. That's okay. Unhappy employees can quickly become poison for teams, bringing everyone down. An honest conversation is the best way to make sure each person on your team feels content and fulfilled by their work. Some of the advice in this talk applies to you. Some may not. You know your team best. Follow your instincts, but be careful how much emotion guides your judgment. Collect data whenever you can. It will keep you focused and inform decisions as you grow. Trust your employees. Grant them the freedom to do what they do best, solve problems. Hire people who are happy, trustworthy, communicative, and talented. And above all else, serve as an example of someone who is fair, focused, and enthusiastic. No one wants to work for someone who won't roll up her sleeves and jump in when needed. Thank you so much for having me.